Mas a gente vai começando, então, nesse momento, eu começo apresentando, então, o professor Charles Perfetti. Charles Perfetti, também conhecido como Chuck Perfetti, é diretor e cientista sênior do Learning and Research Development Center, professor no Departamento de Psicologia da Universidade de Pittsburgh e co-diretor do Pittsburgh Science of Learning Center. Seus interesses de pesquisa são direcionados para as ciências cognitivas, no que concerne ao processamento da linguagem e da leitura, incluindo, mas não restritos a, os processos lexicais e sintáticos de nível básico e superior, e a natureza da proficiência leitora. O professor Perfetti conduz estudos sobre o comportamento cognitivo envolvendo técnicas de neuroimagem, como os ERPs, potenciais de eventos relacionados, fMRI, imageamento por ressonância magnética funcional, e MEG, magnetoencefalografia. Seu objetivo com essas pesquisas, com essas tecnologias, é desenvolver uma compreensão mais detalhada sobre como a linguagem é processada no cérebro. O professor Perfetti é autor da hipótese da qualidade lexical, segundo a qual a riqueza das representações mentais sobre os significados das palavras impactam nas habilidades de leitura e compreensão. Com mais de 500 artigos publicados, o professor Perfetti possui mais de 50 mil citações no Google Scholar. Isso eu andei olhando essa semana. Em 2017, recebeu a distinção de honra da Federação de Associações das Ciências do Comportamento e do Cérebro, a Federation of Associations in Behavior and Brain Sciences, pela importante contribuição da sua pesquisa para os estudos da mente, cérebro e comportamento. Além dessa biografia acadêmica, é preciso dizer que o professor Perfetti é muito generoso, acolhendo em seu laboratório estudantes e pesquisadores do mundo inteiro. Alguns dos membros do grupo de pesquisa Linguagem e Cognição da Unisc tiveram o privilégio de serem recebidos no seu laboratório. As professoras Lucilene Bender de Souza e Adriana Ries, e os doutorandos Débora Borsatti e Rafael Jacobsen. O Rafael, então, que ainda não foi para os Estados Unidos, está aguardando o visto. Sem mais delongas, então, temos a satisfação de passar a palavra para o professor Perfetti. Thank you, Professor Perfetti, for accepting our invitation and for sharing your time and knowledge with us. It's a big pleasure and it's an honor for us.
Thank you, Professor Gabriel. Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. And although I don't understand Portuguese, I'm going to assume that you said nice things about me when you introduced me.
Yeah, for sure.
Is everyone able to see my screen now? Are we sharing okay?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, so I will begin. Again, it's a pleasure to be invited to your Reading and Cognition Colloquium. When I was invited by Deborah, I thought maybe I would talk about research, and then I reconsidered. I've got so much interesting research that I would like to talk about, but I thought it would be an occasion for a broader talk that gives a perspective on the progress in research in reading science, and then some gaps between that progress and other things. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to begin by showing you the beautiful campus I'm pleased to live in. Perhaps more of you will be able to visit me someday, but please don't come just because of the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, which you see there as one of our main buildings. Because it's not always blue sky and beautiful here, but our cathedral has been standing for many years, and it is beautiful. But Pittsburgh is more than just a nice campus. Relevant for my talk today, it's also a birthplace of reading science. The reason I say that is because of this person. Edmund Burke Huey was the first chair of psychology in University of Pittsburgh, 1904 to 1909. And while he was chair, he wrote this marvelous book called The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading. That 1908 book has stood the test of time, and to this day, it has a lot of findings about how people read and how children learn to read that are still correct. That is, basically, many of the things that Huey said in his book have been elaborated in research since then, and that becomes part of the progress that I want to talk about. Okay, we are back live, and I have just shown this picture of Huey, and what I want to talk about now is progress in reading science since his time. And what I'm going to do over the next 30 minutes or so is talk about some of the progress that's been made in reading science since 1908. I have to say that most of this progress happened after about 1960, because there was a long period in which there was not very much reading research. But I would like to paint a big picture for everyone about progress in how words are read, in how to understand word reading problems, reading comprehension, and the importance of universal perspectives in reading. Much of the progress has been enabled by having tool development. One example of a tool that's been very important in helping reading science learn more about how reading works is the eye tracker. Eye trackers allow very precise information about where the eyes are at any time. This has helped us learn, for example, how little information is available to the reader when the eyes are moving. And of course, we have neuroimaging tools, especially fMRI. fMRI doesn't tell us much about time, but it tells us a lot about space, the information on brain areas that are active during reading. And we have event-related potentials based on brain waves that are generated just below the scalp and give us these event-related potentials, very precise information on when things happen during reading, timing of perceptual and cognitive events, and a little bit of information about the brain areas involved. ERPs are especially important in my lab. We do a little bit of fMRI, but event-related potentials are locked into the time processes of reading that we are interested in. So the progress begins with the way I want to frame the progress is by referring to the reading systems framework, which is something that I have developed in as a way of communicating and organizing the systems that have to cooperate during successful reading. So it's a series of essentially knowledge and processing systems. And on this slide, you see the top, the knowledge systems include orthographic knowledge, which is what you know about your writing system. Linguistic knowledge, what you know about phonology and syntax and morphology implicitly, that kind of knowledge that drives your language comprehension, and of course also reading, because reading depends upon language. And finally, the general knowledge that is what you know and store in memory about everything you've encountered in life, all your conceptual knowledge and everything that can be brought to bear, not only during reading, but during language comprehension. So that is one of the subsystems. And you see the arrows from those knowledge systems come down to the word identification system. That is the system that takes input from vision that tells you about the graphs that you're seeing on the page and converts them into language and concepts, and includes the lexicon, which is to say the mental representation you have of word meanings. The third big part of the system is the comprehension system, in which the reader derives meaning out of words, builds them into sentences, builds sentences into larger understandings of texts. Sentences get parsed, configured into structures that are necessary for understanding, and processes like comprehension monitoring and the generating of inferences become really important. Especially important there is this middle box, which is turned purple because it's part of the word identification system in blue and part of the comprehension system in pink. So it's at the pivot position. And when you combine blue and pink, you get this pale purple to kind of highlight the importance of the lexicon. I can show that also here, where it's a little clearer. In other words, what the reader knows about words is the output of the word identification process, and it's the input to the comprehension processes. So it's right in the middle, smack in the middle of everything, and has a special importance because of that. It turns what we see in the letter strings into meaning, and the meaning then feeds the rest of the comprehension system. So let's start with how words are read as the first item of progress. And for that, I simply have highlighted or upgraded the word identification system. So this is the part of the reading systems framework that's in focus when we talk about word identification. Information comes in from vision, activates what we know about the orthographic units or the spellings. The spellings activate their corresponding phonological units, phonemes, speech segments, syllables. What the units are depends upon your writing system. If you're reading alphabetically, these units are phonemes. If you're reading a syllabary, these units are syllables. One of the major items of progress is worth emphasizing is the focus on the eyes, on the vision. Let me go back just a second. So what I'm talking about now is that part right there on the left where the visual input is coming in. This is actually before you're reading a word, but the visual stimulation that begins the process. You can't identify a word unless it's in the center of your vision within 2 degrees of visual angle. High resolution vision is therefore critical in reading. What this means is that you are not seeing a word beyond 4, 5, or 6 letters. This English example shows that the eyes are focused on the word spark in the middle, and anything, say over here where my cursor is, I think people can see my cursor over on thinking, is beyond the foveal view, and you're not going to be able to see it. You might see some up or down lines like the K in the upper vertical bar in K in thinking, or the H in thinking, but you can't identify enough letters to really read the word. So this is a major constraint in how fast we can read, because the eyes have to fixate a lot during a text and have to come to rest on words every 3 or 4 words to really be able to sample enough of the text to be successful. This means that speed reading is probably not all it's cracked up to be. And this little joke by Woody Allen, who said he took a speed reading course and then read War and Peace in 5 minutes and concluded that it was about Russia. That's a way of saying that you just can't go very fast and still understand what you're reading. So this is one kind of progress over the years. We've learned that when the eye is at rest, you get the information out of what you're looking at, and when it's moving, you don't, and you only see a little bit while the eye is at rest. Now, the the main part about reading is beyond the vision part. It's about what happens here inside the word identification system as these orthographic units and phonological units interact and bring information from the lexicon about what words you're seeing. The progress is marked especially by the development of dual route models, which were developed really to explain English word reading and can be applied to other alphabetic writing at least. The simple way of understanding this model, which I know many of you will already understand, is to see this little diagram in which reading encodes the letters. You recognize the letters, you can turn the letters into their sounds. Those would be phonemes in alphabetic reading, and that leads you to the word. That's the indirect or recoding route. Or you can take this direct route from the letters to the word. And when I say you can, I don't mean that you have some kind of choice in it. It depends on what you know, how familiar the word is. Eventually, at high levels of skill and high frequent words, we learn to do this. But this route is actually more reliable, from letters to phonemes to word, because this is the only way you could read something like Shiva, which is a nonsense word. It has no meaning. And if it's being used in Portuguese in a way that I don't know, then you can correct me. But it's different from Shiva, which is the Portuguese word for key. So this indirect route can read any letter string that you can imagine, both a word that's not really a word, and as well as a word that is a word. And of course, on this route, it can read only words because this word is represented in your lexicon, and only a word you've experienced can have a representation of its spelling in the lexicon. Often it's said that the indirect route is for children and the direct route is for skilled adults. So there's a sense in which this is true. If we become really, really skilled and read lots and lots of words, we're using this quite a bit. Now, this is a kind of a play model of the dual route model. Here's what the real model looks like, and I'm not going to explain it in detail. I just want to remind you that there's a very specific set of assumptions the model makes about how visual feature units activate letter units and orthographic, the orthographic lexicon and the semantic system. All these things come into play in a very systematic way. This is a picture of Max Coulthart, who developed the model, and this graph on the right shows how successful this model is in predicting word reading accuracy. So that very simple dual route model that I showed in kind of simple, very simple form, when it's implemented in a computational program that uses this kind of structure, it is a tremendously accurate a model that helps us understand how people recognize familiar words, less familiar words, non-words. One of the big questions in word identification historically was the role of phonology, that is, whether the sounds of the word are part of what the reader gets when they read. The early ideas on this included that reading was basically a visual only process. In a way, that could be understood as what the direct route is showing, the one that I just showed. But even the direct route involves phonology, and that's what the big progress is about. That is, it seems to be the case that the sound of a word is part of identifying the word. So even if you take that direct route, the sounds of the word are activated as part of word identification. And this has overturned the earlier idea that people could read. It was once said that people can learn to read English the way they read Chinese. And there the somewhat incorrect assumption was that Chinese read without phonology. That's one of the things that I've done research on, and that turns out not to be the case. What's happened is that through lots of experiments with different paradigms over the years, these are citations of some papers and research labs using different methods that have demonstrated that when we read a word, the sound of that word is activated in our minds and in our brains as part of the identification process. And a common example that many of you may know or have read about in English, it's the easiest way to understand the experiments by Van Orden. In English, if I were to say, you're going to see names of, press a button every time you see a name of a flower, and you see ROWS, which in English is not rows, but rows, as in rows of flowers and rows of houses. People make mistakes and their decision times are slowed down. And presumably that's because when they read rows, the sound is activated and that activates ROSE, which of course is the flower. So that's one of many different experimental procedures that have convinced us that phonology is pervasive during silent word reading. So even when we're reading silently, phonology happens and it has some critical properties. The most important is that it seems to be automatic. It's not something you can suppress very easily. It's built into the recognition system because you have linguistic knowledge about how words are pronounced, and that is part of the association you have when you read a letter string. It's also sublexical as well as lexical. That means that the pronunciation that's activated includes the sounds of particular phonemes, like the letter A, we would say in English, corresponding to the phoneme A in a language like Portuguese or Spanish. And that it's richly phonological. It has suprasegmental features like syllabic stress. You actually can hear the stress of a two-syllable word, whether it's on this first or second syllable, for example, in your brain. The question is what the function of this phonology is. If you can identify a word directly, why would you get the phonology? The fact is that it does have a function. It helps stabilize the word identity. That is, it tells you this word that you can hear the pronunciation of, as well as this word that looks the way it's spelled. It stabilizes the identity in that sense. It gives you redundancy. It gives you a phonological representation as well as an orthographic one. And it seems to have an important role, in supporting sentence memory and comprehension. You find that a person can remember a word earlier in the sentence by retrieving its pronunciation rather than its spelling. It's the pronunciation that gets used in memory and comprehension and in repairing comprehension errors. The brain, of course, is involved in word identification, and we could spend the rest of the time on how the brain does reading and how it handles phonology. I'm only going to say a couple things about it. The idea of neuroskeptics there means that people who have worked on cognitive models of word reading haven't always thought the brain was going to tell us anything interesting about it. Here's a picture of the reading network in the brain as described by Stanislas Dehaene, based on lots of research, and this was in his 2010 book. Word identification begins with visual inputs that come into the occipital cortex and activate orthographic representations, word spellings, in what's sometimes called the visual word form area. The green areas seem to cooperate to produce meaning. The orange areas cooperate to produce pronunciation and attention. So that's one model that sort of incorporates what we've learned from brain behavior experiments to try to associate brain areas with the simple act of identifying a single word. What's interesting to me and why I'm bringing this up at all is that it's never been clear whether this, what we learned from the brain corresponds to what we've learned from behavioral studies. And in this very nice paper by Taylor et al., they studied all the brain activation data that have been reported in publications about word and pseudo-word reading. And they asked how those areas, which are shown up in the brain picture, whether they correspond to elements in the dual route model. I put Max Coulthard's picture there again, just to be a retrieval cue, to cause you to remember that what we're talking about in the dual route model is that, whoops, is this, sometimes I hit that, is this right here. So they have, the color coding is significant. So here's the blue area, the phoneme system. The brain studies find the inferior frontal gyrus to be very active for phoneme processing. The grapheme phoneme rule system, the sublexical network, and the inferior parietal cortex, and so on. Without going over the details here, the general picture is that there is a correspondence between what's found in the brain studies and what's been postulated in these cognitive models, especially the dual route model, but also the triangle model, which for those of you who know about parallel distributed models, recognize as an alternative way of implementing a dual route model without quite as much structure. But that is a whole other topic. But both of these models can be connected to what we've learned about the brain. And what that means is that we get stronger converging evidence and therefore a stronger commitment to believing the basic elements of the different components of word reading. Let me turn briefly now to word reading problems as my second example. Once again, early ideas turned out to need correction over time with the progress we've made. The early ideas were basically about visual deficits, and I've given a couple of citations there, including the famous theory of Orton, which to this day has carried the idea that people who have trouble, children who have trouble reading have letter reversals, and that's because there's a visual problem. That turns out not to be the case. And over the years, there's been evidence that leads to some different ways of thinking about reading disability. And the dual route model is handy here because it says you can have a reading disability in one of two ways. You can have an impaired indirect route going from phonemes to word, or you can have an impaired direct route. And studies by Castles and Coulthard and others were able to show that this applies to children who had trouble reading. That is, most of them had trouble, most children who have trouble reading have trouble on both of these routes, but some seem to have only trouble on the direct route. The majority who had trouble on only one route had trouble on this one. They were unable to read pseudo words. They were unable to convert letter strings into a pronunciation. They were impaired in the decoding route. Interestingly, over time, other ideas came to suggest that really when we find someone who has trouble on this route, it's just that they haven't had enough experience to establish specific representations for individual words. So if you haven't experienced many words, you can't use the direct route. You have to read to build that route up. So the idea came to be that some of the children who were being called dyslexic didn't have a true reading disability. They simply had not read enough to build up the direct route. That's one of the reasons behind the ascendance of phonology as the main problem in word reading problems in dyslexia. Phonological deficit has become the main explanation of dyslexia. These little circles and ellipses are just examples of key research over time, widely cited research that led to this conclusion. And I'll kind of summarize with a couple of quotes. I think one of the most telling is that the International Dyslexia Association, way back in 2002, decided to use phonology and decoding as part of the definition of dyslexia. As it says here, dyslexia is a learning disability that is neurobiological. It's characterized by difficulties in word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding, and that these difficulties arise from a deficit in the phonological component of language. In a book on dyslexia across languages, my co-authors and I reached this conclusion studying 9 different languages that had dyslexia. And for each language, it was pretty clear that phonological difficulties were associated with dyslexia. In alphabetic languages, that was mainly difficulty with phoneme awareness and processing at the phoneme level. But in syllable-based languages like the Japanese kana or Chinese, those problems were at the syllable level rather than at the phoneme level. I should also point out that in Chinese especially, there are other orthographic causes, not only phonological. So the conclusion is not that phonology is the only cause. It is the major cause in dyslexia across different languages, including languages that are not alphabetic. That brings me to reading comprehension as our third area of progress. So reading comprehension is much more complex than word identification. And here's the comprehension system that I have brought up from the reading systems framework. The lexicon on the left and these processes of parsing, text representation, situation model on the right. Here's my view on how early comprehension research worked and what it provided. The early approaches were to look at comprehension from the top down. I illustrate what I mean by that by having you read this passage in English, if you can. I suppose maybe you'll hear a Portuguese translation of this passage. In English, the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. And it goes on like this. It's very tedious. It's very abstract, and it's hard to tell what it's about, even though the sentences seem all pretty good. They're fairly good English sentences. But people have trouble remembering and understanding this text unless you say ahead of time, this passage is about washing clothes. And then it all makes sense, because then you have things, these words refer to something. So the procedure now, you can imagine, is the procedure of washing clothes. And when you see groups, you realize we're talking about groups of clothes. And if you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's saying, do you have to go to a laundromat, or can you have the washing machine in your apartment, and so on. This is a well-known passage from Bransford and Johnson, and what it illustrated is the importance of knowledge. It did not study how people understand beyond how they use the knowledge. And so I have my characterization in terms of the reading systems framework is that comprehension research was largely concerned with the role of general knowledge and how you build up what's called a situation model. That is, how you understand what's being written about. In that case that I just showed you, the situation model would have been about washing clothes. And that's really, those two highlighted areas in this reading systems framework is really all those early studies told us. They ignored the meaning of the text. They ignored the parsing process that configures words within sentences. And of course, they ignored also even the lexicon. The big progress came in flipping the top-down approach and adding a bottom-up approach to it, so that reading became a truly interactive process. The bottom-up says that you begin with word identification, including meaning. As you read several words, you configure them into meaningful syntactic phrases, or syntactic phrases that have meaning, and you understand the meaning of this series of words, and you build up that way to text meaning. Words, sentences to text. And of course, there's information from your knowledge from the outside world that strengthen your ability to get the text meaning. A big advance that helped bring the bottom-up approach along with the top-down approach was the construction integration model of Walter Kinch. It's a very old article by now, but it did what was very important. It said we have to understand the building up of comprehension from the word level as well as the top-down part of it. What the model did was show that there's a very early phase while you're reading in which activation of all kinds of information that are associated with a word become active in your brain, just for milliseconds. Most of that information is not relevant and it gets suppressed or deactivated when you place the word in its context. But sometimes, no matter how strong the context, there are associations to the word that get activated. The critical part then was a second phase in which the meaning of a word in context becomes integrated with your understanding of the text to that point, and external knowledge is combined with it to help you select the relevant information and build up understanding. That was an important step, because what it did in terms of the reading systems framework was bring all these other things into the model. Everything except parsing. The people who study text comprehension ignore sentence processing, and they leave it to linguists and psycholinguists to worry about how we parse sentences. And so that was pretty much left out, but at least there was an emphasis on text meaning and these things on the right, how people can monitor their comprehension and how they have to make inferences in order to make a text make sense, and how this lexicon provides lots of information that gets used in an automatic way. So that represented a lot of progress in understanding the cognitive processes of comprehension. I'm showing this slide to indicate two things. There are 8 different theories of comprehension that have developed, a couple about the same time as Kinch, but most of them after that. All of them are kind of consistent with that general framework. But the reason there are so many is that they don't compete with each other. They're all on a different aspect of comprehension. They all emphasize something different. And that's a sign to us that comprehension has a lot of complexity. And if we go back to word identification models just for a second, they were very competitive. People developed models to compete and show that their model was the best. In comprehension, these models don't compete with each other. They just talk about different things. So if you're going to do research on comprehension, you might be locked into one or more of these theories. The final piece of progress I want to talk about is increasing the universal aspect of reading science. Because as David Scher pointed out in an article in 2008, at a time when there was actually already quite a bit of non-English work, David Scher pointed out that English, because English was been the main language in which the research was done and focused on, that English is actually an outlier orthography in terms of spelling sound correspondence. And of course, you all realize that English words are not pronounced consistently. The pronunciation and their spellings are not mapped one-to-one to the degree that other alphabetic languages are. And so that certainly was true. And there has been progress on this, a very early progress that actually preceded the critique that Scher offered was the orthographic depth hypothesis, where alphabetic writing that had a nice one-to-one mapping between letters and sounds were called shallow, and ones that didn't have a nice consistent mapping between letters and sounds were called deep. English is on the deep side. Portuguese and Spanish are relatively high on the shallow side. They're not quite as consistent as Finnish and Welsh, which are maybe the two highest, or even Korean and Italian, but more consistent. French and Danish, not so much. So there was an awareness of the variation in mapping across alphabetic languages, and this is consistent with empirical results that found that English for children, the first, second, third, and fourth grade, the ability to read a pseudo word, and remember the advantage of a pseudo word is that it's not in the lexicon, so you have to be able to do phonological recoding. So again, a word like shiva, which would be a pseudo word, English speaking children had much slower progress on this than French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Swedish, and Finnish. This appeared to be because there is consistent letter to sound mappings in these other languages, but not in English. And so English-speaking children, when confronted with a word that could be pronounced, but it's not a real word and they haven't seen it before, either have trouble pronouncing it or say they don't know how to pronounce it. So this gave some credibility to that aspect of cross-language comparisons, but still that's a rather narrow comparison within the family of alphabetic writing. And the world has many more systems than the alphabetic system. We have the syllabary of the Japanese kana, we have the morphosyllabic system of the Chinese, we have the alpha syllabaries, or the abugida of the basically of the Indian subcontinent and South Asia generally, many languages. And it's not just that we've had a focus on English over the years, we've had a focus on alphabetic writing. So I'm pointing attention to two books that I have been involved with my colleague Ludo Verhoeven. The first one on the left, Learning to Read Across Languages and Writing Systems, has chapters on 17 languages, trying to identify the commonalities among languages as well as how they differ. Second one, Developmental Dyslexia Across Language and Writing Systems, focused on 9 of the languages, 9 of those 17, and tried to determine if there were commonalities for dyslexia across all these languages. So there has been a lot of attention recently to languages other than English and also to languages other than alphabetic languages. And this is really important for developing a universal understanding of reading and the various options it presents that depend on your language and also on your writing system. One of the things we did in this first book is to ask the question of whether languages get the writing system they deserve. This is a question posed some time ago by Halliday and also by others about whether our writing systems just arbitrarily chosen by a language, or to somehow the writing system is somehow optimal for given the language. We developed a scheme to examine that question by looking at different languages. Here I'm showing 4, asking about their phonology and the morphology, asking about their orthography, asking about the empirical results from studies of learning to read and reading development and dyslexia, and filling those in these 4 cases actually suggest how the writing system for those languages does work pretty well with the properties of the language. So Spanish, which would share quite a bit with Portuguese, both Romance languages, phonologically simple, open syllables, relatively transparent orthography with one-to-one mapping. So an alphabet would be just fine for Spanish and for Portuguese and for French and for Italian and even for English, although English is higher in phonological complexity and it has a large number of syllables. Because it has so many syllables, a syllabary wouldn't be good, but a syllabary is just fine for Chinese. It doesn't exactly have a syllabary because the syllables in Chinese are also morphemes. So it's really got syllable morpheme units. But it has so much homophony that if you had an alphabet, you'd always be having a homophone. You wouldn't know whether it's this word or that word. It's just pronounced like a dozen other words. So the Chinese character system actually seems pretty good for that fact. If you've ever seen a Finnish word, you know they can get really long because they inflect words with a lot of morphology, but they don't have very many phonemes. And that makes an alphabet very, very useful. And Finnish has a very transparent alphabet. So this is some of the things that you can make progress on when you try to analyze the language and understand it in relation to the phonology. I want to point this has not been a popular definition. I tried on the world some years ago, but I still think it's true, that learning how to read requires learning how your writing system encodes your language. It doesn't mean you have to learn the difference between an alpha syllabary and a syllabary, or between an alphabet and a syllabary. But it means is that as you learn to read, you actually learn how your writing system is connected to your language. And that's part of what you have to learn. And it leads to part 2 and part 3 of my talk, which I'm going to combine, problems and prospects. So I've been talking about progress. I think the problems worth talking about, yes, there are problems in the science, there are things we don't know, but I think I've always been interested in the ability of research to connect to practice, because reading, learning to read, literacy in general is so important throughout the world that it ought to be able to take advantage of what we learned about how reading works and how learning to read works. But there are problems. The research has made progress. Maybe methods of reading instruction have, maybe not as much as they could have. And the other thing is that even when instruction for beginning reading is good, there are widespread complaints and international data that say kids are not comprehending what they read at the level one would expect. So these are problems and also prospects for improvement. Let me start with the first one. Learning to read is not hard if you're lucky enough. And these are my daughters who are now, back when they were before school in the case of Olivia, and maybe kindergarten for Angela. And many of us have that experience with our children. We read, we talk about books, they read. It's not a problem, but it is a problem in many ways, and that has caused reading instruction to vary a lot around the world and within a country. So Marilyn Adams, way back in 1990, and she's reviewed this situation even more recently, went through the history of how reading was taught in the United States and came up with these 6 different cycles. So this image on the left is supposed to indicate a pendulum swing, right? So pendulum goes from phonics over to meaning-based and then back again. And that's what's happened here. We, in America, started out with what could be called phonics, learning your letters. But there was a revolution in the middle of the 19th century when the wisdom in schools of education said meaning should be emphasized, not sound, whole word sight reading, and so on. And the modern version of the meaning-based idea is the whole language movement of the 1980s. And it's hard to characterize now. There have been some changes. Balanced instruction means whatever one wants it to mean, and it's not quite clear what's going on. So it's not so much a straight line of progress as a pendulum swinging back and forth. The meaning-based approaches represented by Frank Smith and Ken Goodman emphasize the fact that reading is natural, and it can seem that way, but it's really not. Language is natural, yes, but reading is an invention, a cultural invention, and it's not biologically given that it's natural. Goodman had what is called the 3 cueing systems, and the only reason I want to mention it is because it's still being used in the United States as a way to train teachers. And this idea, if a child is reading and they come across a word that they're not sure of, well, if they come across a word in any case, they're encouraged to use the context to make a guess at what the word might be. So that's the semantic cue. Or they can be inside a sentence and have the, and then there's a word after the. So they could use their syntactic cue that if it's the in English, there's probably a noun of some kind. And then if these semantic and syntactic cues don't work, and this was what was so bizarre to me, that then the graphophonetic cues, by which they meant the letters of the word, could maybe be used to figure out what the word was. I think a lot of us would find this backwards. We would certainly agree that the adult reader, the skilled reader, has all of these cues going on at the same time. But the real input to the word identification system is the graphophonetic input, and it needs to have more salience, more importance. And whole language, the idea that, well, it's the idea that language, the reading is natural, and that you shouldn't bother with phonics, basically. There has been quite a bit of evidence-based improvement in instruction. US has had many conferences. This is the basis, this Scientific American article that I was involved in is based on a National Academy of Science conference that reviewed all the literature and decided that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the importance of decoding skill, phonemic awareness, and direct instruction. I point out 2 quotes that I think are especially interesting. On phonemic awareness, Bryant and Goswami said that research causally linking phonemic awareness to successful reading is one of the most important discoveries of cognitive science. And the work by David Scher, Jorman Scher, on how we come to represent the spelling of a word in our minds, how we, in other words, acquire a word-specific representation so that we can use that direct route. And the way that's done is through decoding. When you decode a word, you get feedback and use the feedback on the pronunciation to fine-tune your understanding of the spelling, and that helps you acquire the specific word representation. So the next time you see this word that you've decoded, you can actually start to use a more direct route with enough practice. So that's what the research says. There have been some obstacles, limitations to having this research be used. But there's more to it than that in terms of what has limited progress in literacy education. One I want to point to is not, and haven't been talking about this, is that we haven't, in the cognitive framework, certainly we aren't paying a whole lot of attention to the socio-cultural contexts, the home and community literacy environments, the language factors and the language of instruction, which become very, very important. You know, we're focusing on the cognitive part, and that's important, but then there's a question of how you get to the cognitive part. What's the role of home literacy? What do you do if you come to school and you've never had a chance even to sort of learn the alphabet? In a new volume in our international series, Verhoeven and I, along with Shonali Nag of Oxford, have put together an edited volume on global literacy, which looks at developing countries and places that have been colonialized and had to learn to read in a language other than their own. Brazil is one of the countries, by the way, that gets quite some scrutiny in this book as part of a chapter on South America. Indigenous languages and whether a child can be taught in their native language or whether they're going to learn English or Portuguese or whatever the colonial language was. These are all factors that are really important. But my talk has been about the cognitive aspects, and there the limitation is simply a weak set of connections between research and practice. In other words, what we know is not getting used. And I'll cite just this the American example for example, the 3 queuing system that I hope I just critiqued sufficiently so that you know it's not particularly evidence-based, is still dominating in some areas in the United States, still dominates teacher preparation. Teachers have working groups on the 3 queuing system. They have professional development on the 3 queuing systems. Our schools of education, it's getting better, but generally speaking, it seems to be the case that I hope there are no deans of education, or I guess what I hope is that there's a dean of education at your university who is in a different category, but some of these in the American system are not able to explain scientific principles about how children learn to read. That doesn't mean they don't know it, but it means that it's way beneath their radar, and they may be promoting less than optimal teaching practices in the education of future teachers. Well, I want to leave that now to conclude with another problem in practice, which is comprehension. Because even when kids are learning the fundamentals and learning to identify words, they're not achieving the levels of comprehension that one can expect, one should be able to expect. So, you know, maybe as many as 1 out of 5 children are reading or comprehending less than they should based on their word identification. There's a high correlation between word identification and comprehension, don't get me wrong, but some kids seem to be okay at word identification and not so okay at comprehension. And the question becomes, how do we help so-called poor comprehenders? There are 2 basic options. One is strategy intervention. So there are interventions trying to help people be better at making inferences, or strategies helping them to be better at monitoring their comprehension. There are other kinds of interventions that are not about strategies, but about knowledge. For example, raising vocabulary. Vocabulary knowledge is so important. Remember, it's in the center of the reading systems. That's a way to increase comprehension. But because it's hard, you know, 1 word at a time, vocabulary interventions are limited as well. But the other way is practice at reading. Practice is the way you get better at things. I put practice in quotes because you don't practice reading just by, by saying, I'm going to practice now. You practice it every time you read. But practice should not get a bad reputation because it's the way we get better at everything. How about tennis? You get better at tennis by playing tennis. Oh, of course, you can have isolated practice on your serve, but you get better by actually playing. How about the piano? You get better at the piano by actually playing the piano. Reading is no different. You get better at reading comprehension because you read and comprehend what you read. What's needed is a sustained text reading. That's what improves comprehension. The problem is, if you're not good at reading, you might not want to do sustained text reading. You have to have engagement. Sustained engagement with the text is what's critical. And that engagement has to be effective. So you want sustained, effective engagement with text. And that's what successful practice in reading looks like. The question then becomes how to support effective engagement. And I want to conclude, and I thank those of you who have been able to stay beyond time with one example of how one can support effective engagement. Just one example, there are many other ways. But I've been involved with a team of researchers in comprehension who have been working with game developers at Amplify, who have developed digital games to support reading, and not just digital games, but evidence-based digital games. I'm showing a screenshot of a couple of the games we're working on that they have developed. The research team didn't work on the games. The research team is trying to study the impact they have on children's comprehension as they use these, and thousands of children using them in schools. And I just want to point out how it might work. So on the top screen is an item from a game called Sloppy Scrolls, where the student is asked to click on a sentence that does not fit. This little text says, after 8 years, Max wanted his black belt in karate. He passed the test. Max was proud of his new belt. Not bad, considering he just started taking karate. So this sentence, when you read it, should be inconsistent with a previous sentence about after 8 years. Didn't just start taking karate, he's been doing it for 8 years. We know that children who have trouble comprehension fail to monitor their comprehension, and it's not clear why, but this is a case of a game trying to promote comprehension monitoring. If the child clicks on that, the child shows that he or she realizes there's a contradiction, and they get game points, and it's fun. At the bottom is a different game called Unmask That. It's simply to have the child understand that the pronoun it requires a reference. You know, it's easy to read it. You come across the word it and you don't bother to think that it refers to anything. So here, the child reads that Henrietta was playing with an empty glass bottle at dinner. As she passed it over her brother's face, it made his nose bigger. Well, it, the child has to click on it and draw a line with the cursor just back to empty glass, as opposed to brothers, because it may be brother's face that she thinks it is, or dinner. So it's a simple game. And with many, many games like this, the idea is that the child will have engaging practice in reading that could pay off. It's one way to get practice going. The general idea has to be to find out something someone wants to read and hope they can be able to practice it. And you might have to make the text in their comfort zone, not too hard, not too easy. I'm to my conclusions now. What I've tried to present is that over 112 years since UWI, we've had a lot of progress in reading science. The most dramatic progress has come in the very recent years, the last 20. Reading practice, the teaching of reading has progressed too, but it's very uneven, and it's limited by traditions that support poor practice. And finally, I pointed out that even with good practice, we have problems in supporting reading comprehension. And I presented just one of many ways that we could stimulate engaged reading practice for students. And it's time for my final words. And in my limited Portuguese, I will say, muito obrigada. Shall I stop sharing? It's getting dark in my office.
Now it's 7:30 there.
Where's my glass of wine?
Yes, you should have it now. It's getting dark.
It's
time for wine.
Dark. How about where you are? Is it getting dark there too?
Yes, it is dark. Completely now.
So we went a little over, but I think that was because of the technical difficulties. To the extent
Yes,
I took longer.
Excellent.
Okay.
We have some questions.
Should I look in the chats or will I hear them?
Yes, you can see them on the chat, but I can read them for you.
Please.
The first one is Rafael, who is probably going to study with you. He asks, my research is about reading while listening as a possible tool to enhance reading comprehension and listening comprehension. In which way do you think these two language modes, listening and reading, may help each other in order to help the reader listener to improve his comprehension skills?
Well, I am an advocate of this idea. I'm guessing though that it's a little tricky to pull off. It's probably there's probably an optimal way of doing this that is enhancing, and there's a way of doing that so that it's a kind of dual tasking that is actually could have a negative impact. So it depends critically on the details. But because reading is dependent on language, essentially having multimodal inputs to the lexicon as you read a word and you hear it, if they're in synchrony, that could be helpful. I'd be very interested in learning later on from Rafael about the details. I think we know just from experiments, for example, that you actually can change your phonological representation of a word to make it conform to its spelling. This is an issue in English where the spelling isn't always the same as the pronunciation. And so you actually can enhance your listening perception through orthography, and you can certainly improve your ability to recognize a word, identify it through listening. So it depends critically on the details. And it's really, the assumption has to be this, that the ability to understand what you hear is automatic, right? Because it won't work if the two tasks require effort. You can't have two effortful tasks. That's a condition of massive interference and dual tasking. So this might not be good for a child. So some children having language disorders, for example, would have listening problems, and it might not be so good unless it's done in a different way. But for a child who is pretty good at listening, then it could be a big help.
Okay.
Does Rafael want to do you want to let people follow up? Or you're in charge, you go ahead. So if Rafael didn't like that answer, he can send me a text later.
Okay. Let me see if he wrote any comment here.
But
No.
we could give a chance also to Ana Munari, who has a question.
Yeah.
Yes, Anna asked, I find that when I read silently in English or another language that is not mine, my first language, I hear the words more inside my mind than when I read it in Portuguese. Is it just an impression, or could it even be a cognitive issue?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I think I would suggest this possible explanation that in a non-native language, the inner voice can be raised to a level of consciousness, whereas in your native language, it's just running quietly in the background, but it's always there. But I think it could be interesting. So I guess I would ask this: if you've got English as your best second language and you have some other language as a distant third, I would ask whether it's even more pronounced in the third than in the second language. That could be an interesting thing. But it makes sense. I wonder also about the rhythms you hear in the speech, because I actually hear the rhythms of the speech when I know the person who has written me a text. So I could hear Deborah's Portuguese accented English when I read her text messages.
So nice.
One of the more interesting experiments in this from the past was you had a subject in an experiment meet a person before reading something they had written. You would meet the person in this lab setting, and you'd have a 5-minute conversation. And in one case, the person you met was a very slow speaker. They spoke like this, very carefully. And in the other case, the person went real fast like this, and they spoke very quickly. And then you went and read a message from each of them. And you read the slow speaker's message more slowly than the fast speakers, as if you were mimicking their rhythm. So this inner voice has some really interesting, rich qualities that go beyond just the phonology of the word that seem to capture aspects of the speech.
Okay.
I can read. I have the window open now.
Oh, okay. You have
but
it.
you can
Right.
you can choose. Why don't you choose someone?
Oh,
Lucilene,
I see a friend. I see a
Lucilene
friend
is
there.
here.
Yeah,
Yes.
Lucilene.
Yeah, you know that Lucilene was my student years ago, and so we are always kind of in touch, and we are very happy to have her with us today. And we know that she loved to be with you when she was in Pittsburgh. She learned a lot there. Yeah.
I remember that period well, and I remember her very well. So it's a pleasure to have her here today.
Yeah.
Oh, she's asking a question though. Shall I read it? Is it possible to determine to what extent it shows vocabulary assessment, to what extent it shows lower vocabulary or no? Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, see, right. Vocabulary. What is vocabulary? It's a word related to a concept. So you can have the concept and not know the word. If you know the word, if you really know the word and can pass the vocabulary test, to me that means you have the concept. But there are concepts that you know that you might not know the word for. So I think the answer is both. But a careful vocabulary assessment should certainly pick up a lot of the conceptual knowledge that you have. In fact, the difference between two words that have related meanings is a fine point of conceptual knowledge. And so our multiple choice vocabulary tests usually give you very obvious choices. They could be made more difficult by testing two very closely related concepts in which one is just more correct than the other.
Yeah, there is another question here that is very interesting, because Rosiane, she asks about the social issues related to the reading teaching. teaching reading. And some of my students and I, we translate article from Seidenberg, 2013. The article is the science of reading and its educational implications, if I'm not wrong. And in one point, he also speaks about something that I think is very, very, very important for Brazil, because it's a big country, that is the variation in spoken language. So you have socio-linguistic issues, also having an interfering in the teaching of reading. So I think Rosiana is asking about these issues, about the differences in access to reading materials, but also I would add the language, the oral language that the kid is using every day has also a role, an important role in these differences to learn to read and to comprehend, of course, to understanding.
Well, yeah, that is a really, really big issue. And I'm, so I mean, there's the kind of local issue of, what language is being used? Are you using the person's native language? Is their second language good enough? So for an indigenous language for whom Portuguese is a second language, is it good enough to acquire reading in? Then there are all these correlates that have socio-linguistic and social correlates, like we know that the number of in America anyway, correlations between books in the home and success at reading is high. But does that mean the books were instrumental, or does that just mean the parents had better income and so on? But the socio-cultural and socio-linguistic issues get very broad. In this, one of the chapters in this book I mentioned, where we're looking at this was I think on development in Africa. I did a case study of two children from the same village and the same language background, and the differences in their parents' views about reading were so different that it was striking that they were part of the same community. In one case, there was no interest on the parents in reading. The reading wasn't valued. They wanted nothing to do with it. And if the child went to school and learned, so that's okay. But the other was quite different, valued reading, although they themselves were not that literate. These kinds of things are just so powerful and so much dependent on other factors, including the parents' education themselves, their socioeconomic status, whether they can afford books and so on. So it's something that cannot be neglected. A lot of progress has been made on the cognitive aspects of reading, but there's a lot more to learn. And the Brazil case is so interesting. I mean, because of all the languages, I mean, and it's such a big country, right? You have 1/2 of the population of South America is in Brazil. And you've had a big increase in the number of children being educated in reading in the primary grades. You've gone over, I think what I saw was, I don't know, over 10, 15 years, you've gone from 70% or so to over 90% of children now entering first grade. And that, I'm sure that varies in terms of their socioeconomic class and their first language and their community and what part of Brazil they're in. But it's I suspect that Brazil has one of the biggest, most heterogeneous issues to face in terms of language background, social background, and rural, urban, and the whole thing. And not an easy thing to say just one word about.
Yes, yes.
Or put it
And
one more
also-
way.
Ele estava falando, né, né, Rosângela, sobre a diferença né, que o Brasil é um país muito grande, que tem muitos fatores, né, que acabam influenciando, como as diferenças sociais e tudo isso, né,
para Rose, sim, isso. Okay. I thought also, Professor Perfetti, that when you said about dyslexia, yeah, and you were talking about the direct route, and that the children might not have enough reading experience to have those words in their mental lexicon. So it's really and the amount of experience with reading will make a lot of those new words that you will get in touch when you learn to read, and that will maybe not be there really to make inferences and, you know, to be able to comprehend what you are reading. So I think that's it's something that for us is a big challenge for all countries. But I think if you have a less unequal society, you have less of that, and we have a lot of that. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a big challenge. I see. Yeah. Oh, this is from Raphael, but he's referring to Adriana, who, of course, yes, I know too. Oh, so she is with Raphael on WhatsApp. Cool. But I'm not sure I know the question. If learning to read encodes your writing system, isn't it a lot like the words appear theory? I'll confess, I'm not sure. Oh, I mean, how could it be a universal process but has to do with your writing system? Okay. Well, that's the question. What is it? What is in common about all writing systems? What's in common is that they all map graphic input to language units. It can be phonemes, it could be whole words even, more likely to be syllables. There really is no, there is no functional writing system that encodes words. The biggest unit is really a syllable. Chinese sometimes is said to do that because they can have one syllable words, but they're really, most of the words are 2 and 3 syllables. And so you're putting together character morphemes to make up a word. So what I want to say is that I regard that as kind of a universal, and it has the potential, of course, to be related to the innate ability you have with your language. In other words, you understand your language, that's biologically given. And all you have to do is recognize that, and parents do this with their children. It comes pretty easily. If you're not, unless the only thing you're doing is looking at the pictures. Pictures get in the way of reading, but they help engagement, so it's okay. But children learn that what they're seeing in print, even before they go to school, has something to do with their language. And all they need to learn is this unit they're looking at, does that correspond to a syllable? If they're lucky, it does, because as we know, phonemes are not very accessible mentally, right? You don't even, it is not the case that you have to have phoneme awareness to learn how to read an alphabetic language. Most children, in fact, do not have a very clear awareness of phonemes. They learn about phonemes with really good decoding instruction during the first weeks of school. When they see a string of letters and have to sound it out, they'll catch on to this fact that there's a sound unit that doesn't have any meaning. But that's what I mean by learning your writing system. You have to sort of figure out how it works in relation to your language. It's just a way of it's a way of making the idea of decoding more general, for example, because decoding doesn't always apply. It's an alphabetic kind of word. In the case of a syllabary, it's just a mapping. There's nothing more to decode it. That unit maps onto a spoken syllable, and that's all there is to it.
Very good.
Oh,
Professor,
there was I see him. I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Raphael or somebody corrected that. So unlike the word, when the last time I looked, it said the words appear theory, and then now it says the Whorf's appear theory. That's completely different. Yeah,
yes.
linguistic relativity. It's about linguistic. Oh, that is such a great example of a text. Words appear versus Whorf's appear. Okay. Yeah. Well, let me point out just one final point about that. I don't agree with this point of view, but I know someone, and I've actually wrote a preface for a book they wrote. They actually are pushing the Whorf's appear idea to apply to writing systems, that the way you view the world depends on your writing system. So you can watch for that. You can watch for that book. Send me a text and I'll connect you to it. I had to write a preface that very carefully recognized the creativity of the argument without endorsing it, because I'm a little skeptical of it, but it's interesting.
Professor, Roger asked a question in Portuguese that says, which readings or what reading material is interesting to think about the reading monitoring, to study about reading monitoring.
So like comprehension monitoring for, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the main thing, and this is kind of a paradox because this is exactly the problem. If you're reading something you don't care about, you might not monitor your comprehension. There are probably times when we all read something and we wake up, we kind of snap to it a few seconds later and realize, I haven't really been paying attention. I don't know what I just read. And sometimes that's because you're tired. You're tired. You've read your third dissertation of the day, and the 90 pages are not so interesting anymore. But other times it's the intrinsic engagement you have with the topic. So what I say, if you can find something that people want to read, they will tend to do comprehension monitoring as long as they're not too fatigued. I think when you become skilled at reading, comprehension monitoring becomes intrinsic to the reading process. It's not something you have to stop and think about. Oh, am I understanding this? You're constantly doing that with every stretch of text that you read. And that's why you can detect something that's not making sense. But I do believe that comprehension monitoring is one thing to work on. And sometimes kids just have to be reminded, pause every once in a while, but it has to be eventually incorporated into the reading procedures themselves.
There is another question here in the chat. Rita de Cássia, she asked if you are aware of studies with children who are raised in bilingual environments, if they have a brain development advantage or in brain development, or if there are studies trying to find this. So she asked if you are aware of that kind of information or data or studies.
Well, if it's about brain in particular, we know that a child who is exposed within a few weeks of birth to sounds that are not in the language that their mother and father or the caregivers are speaking to them, that adds to the plasticity of the brain. That is, it keeps the phoneme boundaries open, and the child is more able to learn a second language, say 6 months later or a year later. this is about sort of the, this is about critical periods and so on. It's not the case that you can't learn a language later, but it's interesting that what happens very early is if you're exposed to a monolingual environment, you learn the phonemes of that language and you form little boundaries around them, and it makes it harder to hear differences that other languages produce. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. But the other aspect of the question, I think, is about bilingualism itself and whether that has an effect on cognitive processes. And of course, there's quite a bit of research on that and strong advocacy among people for being bilingual, strengthening attention and executive processes generally. I think the evidence on that is mixed, and I'm not persuaded that it does that in a robust way. I guess I would always say this, that the big advantage of learning a second language or becoming bilingual is that you can speak more than one language, and that's a huge advantage in itself. And even if there's not a bonus for the rest of your brain, there's that. But it's a big area, and it's worth checking into. And as I said, a big literature.
Professor, we have here in the chat so many comments about people saying thank you, people saying how happy they are to listen you, how wonderful the talk was, and I really I would like to say thank you for the approach you chose for the talk, because you gave a very comprehensive view of the reading studies in this state of art, and that's really interesting for us. We could spend the whole night or maybe the whole year just speaking of each slide, because everything's so interesting. I would like to say also that I love that paper you have in Scientific American with Reiner, Seidenberg, and other colleagues. I found that really balanced in terms of giving phonics what it really makes it really important for children. At the same time, that saying that, well, we have to improve vocabulary, we have to improve curiosity about reading and stuff like that. This is not something that we should fight about. We should stop the wars and the reading wars, and understand that there are a lot of things that we agree, really, and for the sake of the children also, we should stop being so, competitive, and learning with each other about the goods of each approach. And so I think it's an honor really to listen to you, and it was wonderful. And I love also the Woody Allen joke, because my students ask me, do you believe in those courses that you can read, very fast? And I said, oh, I don't think so. You have to have time to read. And if you read something that really it's compelling to you, you have to stop reading really and just think a little bit about what you just read. And so it's not really above one point when you decode very fast. It's not a matter of time anymore. It's about ideas, really.
Right. Well, yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind comments. Professor Gabriel, can I call you Rosangela now?
Yes, of course.
Well, it was my pleasure to join you. Thank you, and thanks for your patience. I think it's your dinner time. You're later than I am, and
thank you.
And I hope to see both of you and others that I haven't been able to see on the screen at some point. And those of you who can come to Triple SR, will certainly we'll get together, and maybe we can have a dinner together. And if we agree not to go to a Brazilian steakhouse, then Which I'm sure. These are very popular in America, as you might know.
Yes. Are you vegetarian?
No, no, I just said that just for a joke. In fact, I like Brazilian steakhouses, in fact, although
Good.
there may be a little too much steak for me sometimes, but yeah, that's fine.
Yes, and
Yeah.
here in the south of Brazil, where we are, we have the best ones.
Oh, well,
So you should consider.
another reason for me to come. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, really, and for your acceptance to be with us. And we hope to be together in person in the States and also in the future here in Brazil. Thank you, Deborah. Yes, Professor.
You're welcome.
And thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone who stayed on and listened so late into the evening. Thank you. It was my pleasure to talk to you today.
And we apologize to you and all the audience about the technical problems.
Oh,
we are really sorry about that.
What would it be without technical problems? It's part of the standard procedure.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good night.
See you all then.
Thank
Have
you.
your glass of
Bye.
wine
Bye.
now. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.